The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the final of our Spring Webinar Series here for European Students for Liberty. My name is Yael Osaski. I'm the Program Manager for ESFL, and we are very, very grateful to have a great guest with us for our final webinar. On for this hour is Associate Professor Dan D'Amico. Professor D'Amico completed his economics PhD from George Mason University in 2008 with field examinations in both constitutional political economy and Austrian economics. Some of you might know his doctoral dissertation, The Imprisoner's Dilemma, the Political Economy of Proportionate Punishment. There have been a lot of great Learn Liberty videos on that. And of course, he's been a constant star on the Learn Liberty YouTube channel. He is, for that dissertation, won the award for the best dissertation in Austrian economics by the Society for the Development of Austrian Economics. Quite an honor. And he is today the William Barnett Professor of Free Enterprise Studies and an Associate Professor of Economics at Loyola University in New Orleans. And he is coming to us live from the Big Easy. So I'll hand it over right now to Professor Dan D'Amico. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the kind introduction, Yael. Yeah, I guess most of you guys, it's like nighttime out there. I was confused getting all these emails that it would be this evening, and here I am. It's 1 o'clock here. Loda was originally the person who asked me to give some comments on this subject, mostly because he had sort of heard my take on some of these issues before. What I aim to do is partially chime into the now raging and infamous thick versus thin debate, or the brutalism versus humanitarianism debate. For starters, what's interesting to take note of is a common summary of competing narratives exists in a lot of different perspectives of intellectual history right now. So most people, when they think about the history of the 20th century, recognize some form of a grand battle of ideas. If anyone in the audience has yet to see it, I highly recommend going online and watching the full sequence of the Commanding Heights series, for example, and the name of Commanding Heights sort of invokes this battle of ideas concept that there were competing worldviews, the sort of socialism, the potentials for like grand central authority on the one hand, and market liberalism and laissez-faire on the other. And the recognition of these alternative paradigms today is used as an analytical framework to recognize how when they butt heads with one another, it helps account for why we get the sorts of policies that we do and why we get the sort of outcomes in society as we do. Society is not necessarily the direct sort of blueprint of either one of the opposing worldviews, but instead sort of the interplay and the bargaining and the sort of arbitrage opportunities that take place between those perspectives. Aside from the Commanding Heights, I would highly recommend viewers take a look at The Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell. It's a very similar framework. He refers to a constrained vision, one where people recognize that human capacity has limitations and imperfections that need accommodation when it comes to political institutions and power, etc., versus an unconstrained vision, which is sort of a parallel for him in terms of progressivism, an idea that government is a great potential power and should be sort of like unencumbered from providing great things for the great society. My own colleague here at Loyola, Nick Capaldi, has a book called The Two Narratives of Political Economy, which is similar. Larry White has a new book out, which surveys these debates in the course of economic ideas. There's a book called The Battle that sort of even brings to light a number of public opinion data on these topics. So what are the two ideas? In purely economic terms, there's obviously like socialism versus capitalism. In more ideological terms, you could think of it as liberalism versus progressivism. One thing that I think is problematic about the way in which we most often discuss this conflict of visions, this battle of ideas, is that if we're overly wedded to the debate being one of political philosophy, it's inherently a discussion charged with normative preferences and normative bias. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're trying to do political philosophy, typically what you're doing is trying to come up with justifications, sort of moral, deontological justifications for why the world should look according to your particular vision. So a political philosophy debate between these worldviews would be something like progressivism versus liberalism. Liberalism would argue that sort of the individual unit of individual people and liberty, the sort of freedom of individuals, is what should be maximized as a goal, as a sort of end state of a society, and whatever political institutions you set up should be aimed at accomplishing that goal. Progressivism, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily aim at the preservation or promotion of individual liberty. It instead has some sort of like other forms of evaluative standards embedded within its framework. They can be Rawlsian, they can be utilitarian, but it's not necessarily individual liberty. So there's multiple types of debate and multiple arenas for disagreement within that setup, progressivism versus liberalism, for example. One point of disagreement could be the moral or deontological disagreement about what the end of or assessment criteria of society should be. We can think of a variety of different standards. We could have a utilitarian standard where we're just looking to maximize the benefit for the most amount of people. We could think of it in terms of an egalitarian standard where we're trying to accomplish some sense of equality across otherwise different groups and demographics. We could think of something like a Rawlsian max-min standard where we're just aiming to make best off the worst amongst us. We could imagine something of a social justice standard more generally, where people are free from the confines of oppression or other forms of systemic inequality. And so you could just have that debate over and over again about whether or not utilitarianism has better foundations relative to Rawlsianism, for example. However, another form of debate that concerns me that doesn't get as much attention, and what I think is arguably and more often the crux of disagreement between particular people who are discussing these ideas, is the sort of positive worldview implications of different ideologies. What do I mean by that? I mean, it's one thing if two people sit down and disagree about how society should be judged and assessed. Should society aim for equality? Should society aim for liberty? We can imagine people who have different preferences and sort of different beliefs and different philosophies that go into their alternative preferences. But it's going to be very difficult for them to have a conversation if they have no common ground about the practical and positive cause and effect relationships of social science. Think of it this way. It's one thing if I'm getting in an argument with someone about where to drive a car or where we're going to go for dinner, for example. Like, I want sushi, you want Italian food. But at the end of the day, if the car is broken and not working and neither one of us necessarily know how to fix it, that could be obfuscated by a debate that centers around the merits or lacking of the qualitative features of those two cuisines. If we don't know how to actually drive, if we don't know how our car actually works, we're probably not going to get to either location effectively. And that's sort of the relationship that I'm concerned about when I see these sort of battles raging within the sort of insular movement of libertarianism. Largely because I think the liberal tradition, especially classical liberalism, sort of forged amidst the Scottish Enlightenment and the classical school of economics, has a very strong contribution to be made in positive social science. To some extent, the classicals sort of invent a scientific method and unique methodological framework for recognizing the special features of human existence through the lens of institutional comparisons, methodological individualism, things like that. So to give a semblance of what I'm talking about, think in terms of a progressive relative to a liberal having a discussion about the merits of a minimum wage policy. That debate will go a certain way as to whether or not we should be aiming at the sort of like protecting of individual rights of employers to pay whatever wage they bargain with an employee, and vice versa. We could have that sort of discussion from a liberal perspective, whereas a progressive might take something like an egalitarian standard and say, no, irrespective of that, this is worth that sort of encroachment on liberalism for the sake of securing the conditional factors of the worst off. But that sort of discussion, to some extent, relies upon an agreement about the cause and effect relationship of minimum wage. Oftentimes, though, we have disagreement on that sort of pure positive science effect of the minimum wage, with a liberal pointing out, well, this policy doesn't necessarily have the effects that you think it's going to have, in contrast to someone on the progressive end believing that the actual implementation will work as they think it will work. So again, I think this insight, this sort of focus on the pure positive aspect of social processes is at the heart and core of the classical liberal project, especially the works of like Adam Smith and F.A. Hayek. So notice how if we had these sort of archetypal characters, a progressive and a liberal sort of arguing about the minimum wage, a Hayekian, right, who's focused on the mechanism and the variable of knowledge, might point that out and say, you know, it's their relative degrees of ignorance regarding the cause and effect relationships of the minimum wage in a complex social environment that's why this debate is still happening. That's why they're not finding agreement, is because they don't necessarily see or comprehend or understand the social world in the same way. So what the title for this webinar was advertised as, For a New Positive Liberalism, what I mean by this is that I think the scientific understanding of social processes, of how individuals act and interact. So like how individuals act is informed by sciences like economics, psychology, neuroscience, behavioral studies, etc. That gives us a vision as to like what the human condition is really all about, how it is that we behave, what are the stimuluses that we react to, how we make choices, what are the tensions between environmental effects on our identity relative to biological factors, relative to choice and logical reason, etc. The other facet of social science is more social, more group-based. So you have everything from sort of organizational management theories, theories of the firm, theories of clubs and groups and religions, etc., all the way to sort of like sociology, macroeconomics, broader social history and social theory. So what I think there is a great potential for in the liberty movement, so to speak, is that you guys are like really nerdy and excited about learning and understanding and appreciating the intellectual substance of liberalism, which is fantastic. I think it would behoove of the movement to unify itself based upon a scientific understanding of social processes, as opposed to normative differences. So, for example, the recent like brutalism versus humanitarian debate, or even like thick versus thin libertarians, it seems like self-identified left libertarians or bleeding heart libertarians or humanitarian libertarians argue a concern for humanity, a concern for the sort of worst amongst us, the concern for the bettering of the worst off, could and should be a sort of unifying mission of the libertarian movement. Like, if you aim to help people, then liberty is the way to go, and it's about sort of winning that discussion. And obviously that's going to have a lot of compatibility with progressive intentions. So if you have this sort of identified libertarian on these humanitarian goals, meet up with a progressive, they're like, okay, what's your goal? They both agree on that. And potentially the debate is going to sort of center around whether or not strategies actually accomplish that, or what the relative role of liberalism versus the power of the state is in accomplishing those goals. On the other side, you can have this sort of like brutalist characteristic where people are more concerned about protecting and promoting individual rights, property rights, etc., whether that's natural rights inspired, and people who want to protect that role of natural rights is what is seen as the unifying mission or the unifying factor of liberalism. Now, I don't think that like either of these is necessarily wrong or either of these is necessarily like problematic, other than the fact that a lacking of the appreciation of the positive science aspects I do think is problematic. So my recommendation, if you had two people sort of arguing, no, we should be unified around humanitarian mission, and someone else who said, no, we should be unified around a rights-based or individualist mission, I would say I think that we should be unified around a shared comprehension of social science. Now, what is that shared comprehension of social science? This is what I think it is. It is that liberty is the most explanatory factor in driving and shaping human welfare around the world and through time. Okay, so that's a positive empirical claim. I believe it's true about history. I believe it's true about sort of contemporary issues and the contemporary variants of wealth around the world. And I think it has a tremendous amount of reform potential and insight for updating contemporary political economy discussions. What does that mean in terms of informing a strategy for enthusiastic libertarian activists today? Well, I think one thing that matters here is something that when I meet and I talk to young libertarians a lot, many are very, very confused on this. Oftentimes, many of our organizations give out a brief essay by F.A. Hayek on the intellectuals and socialism. And so when people get involved in libertarianism, they tend to think that the world is really screwed up and needs to be changed. And they want to know how to spend their efforts to implement the changes that they think will bring about a freer society. And Hayek's essay, The Intellectuals and Socialism, is interesting because he describes a sort of structure of how, not necessarily how society changes, but how the intellectual beliefs and opinions and status of ideology in society comes into play and comes into dominance. So he describes this sort of like echelon of like originators of ideas and second-hand dealers of ideas and sort of like general public, and this dissemination of belief or understanding or ideology or anything like that. Tragically, most of the people who I interact with who have read that essay and been given into it and heard it presented, I think don't really get it. Because they think that this echelon discussion is Hayek's model of social change, that liberalism is this idea. We need second-hand dealers to sort of matriculate that idea and then sort of get the population of people on board with liberty, and then the world will become a freer place. Again, going back to my sort of positive claim that liberty, human freedom, is the greatest explanatory factor in understanding the material conditions of human welfare, right? Like whether or not we're living or dying, whether or not we're starving to death, whether or not we're prospering economically, who's prospering relative to who else. I think that liberty is a very, very important variable in understanding all of that process. It doesn't follow directly from that positive observation or that empirical claim that libertarianism matters. Let me explain what I mean. The real level of liberty in the world, right, how much freedom people have access to, and its effect upon human welfare, might have historically had almost nothing to do with libertarian activism. And I feel like a lot of online discussions that I see and op-eds and a lot of the aiming secondhand dealers are striving to popularize the ideas of liberalism with this specific goal in mind of converting new libertarians per se. But in actuality, the key moments in history that have accomplished the most in terms of liberty had almost nothing to do with a libertarian movement per se. Key examples would probably include things like the Industrial Revolution. While certain aspects of liberal ideas were very important, it wasn't really like a concerted or activist or politically structured grouping of people that brought about those ideas. Deirdre McCloskey's work on this, I think, is probably the most cutting edge and interesting and accurate portrayal of the role of ideology and intellectual beliefs in promoting social change at this juncture in time. But what she describes is basically a sort of accidental process where individual people, merchants, smiths, so to speak, started to think it was cool to be happy about being a merchant. And they created like a general culture of identity linked with production and trade and exchange rather than a conventional sort of like class-based system. But it wasn't like people running around handing out copies of Bastiat's The Law or something saying you should be a libertarian or we should all be defending rights or we should all be like promoting humanitarian interests. It was just this cultural trend that seemed to be a byproduct of population growth and economic prosperity that had already occurred. And then this sort of ideological shift had this self-affirming aspect to it that allowed for and arguably launched industrialization. Another key sort of example that's really funny when people talk about the potentials for policy reform or the potentials for political change, they often point to airline deregulation, right? Airline deregulation happened and air flight prices radically declined, and now global travel and all of the things that are related to it are these much better experiences and more accessible to a lot more types of people. It used to be you had to be really upper class and sort of fancy to take a plane anywhere. Now, pretty much most people in Western developed environments can afford a plane ticket and can afford to sort of see the world, and that's a tremendously liberating experience in and of itself. But in reality, the think tank activist world, the libertarian movement had nothing to do with airline deregulation. Airline deregulation was predominantly put into motion by some nerdy economists crushing economic regression numbers, comparing long versus short flight price spreads to the point where policymakers really couldn't like escape the facts that were in the data and had to do something about it. So again, the idea that liberty will be achieved by converting more libertarians, I don't think is historically true, and I don't think that there's good reason to believe that it will be or should be true in the future. In fact, I think there's a variety of theory and evidence to suggest that it's very much unlikely to be true. So I had a discussion with Jeff Tucker when his Brutalism article came out, and I made a quip that I'm often fond of saying: if everyone woke up tomorrow and decided to be a libertarian, or if everyone woke up tomorrow and put on a Ron Paul T-shirt, or became more activistly concerned about liberty in society, my guess is that society will become less free rather than more free. In other words, the very process of everyone doing anything in unison sows the seeds of its own illiberal problem facet to it. In contrast, if everybody just sort of woke up tomorrow and either genuinely comprehended how society works, right, understood public choice economics a little bit better, understood Austrian business cycle theory a little better. And I don't mean like, oh, they just read that book and they like liked it per se, but rather they genuinely recognized it, like knowing something about physics or knowing something about math. Like if everybody woke up tomorrow a little bit smarter, no matter what scientific field it was, my guess is society would, in fact, be better. And so a lot of times, I mean, the more activist-minded and the more sort of like outgoing amongst organizations like Students for Liberty get a little frustrated with my apparent cynicism or skepticism about particular strategies because of this, because it seems like, oh, well, surely there's a role of activism and surely that there's something that good can be done here. I mean, I just think that the opportunity set is very narrow, and the problems are really tenuous, and that is a theoretical implication of how the world works in the sort of classical liberal tradition. Spontaneous order is directly tied to social complexity. The more complex society is, the harder it is to predict, and therefore the harder it is to navigate and or reform with conscious effort without imposing significant costs. So there's a really great article out right now by political philosopher Michael Huemer on In Praise of Passivity. And so basically his argument is that, well, you know, despite strong moral beliefs and moral preferences for a variety of things, the reality of the world is such that it's really, really complicated. And success on any particular moral margin is likely low. Potential for error and problems and unintended consequences is likely high. So there really isn't a good justification to normatively condemn someone for not supporting your political cause. And the best case that you can really muster in forms of normative activism is people to be more passive, to like not care about how social complex processes distribute and affect people other than sort of your own darn self. And I do think that there's, again, a strong intellectual history to sort of support the basic building blocks of self-interest and almost like a sort of like rational individualist perspective. And I think that that's like the reason why Rand is so historically significant in our movement, so to speak, is because she sort of recognized that the culture writ large was at odds with this, and hers was very much like a reactionary position more so than an original unique perspective in and of itself. So getting back to this idea of Hayek's individualism or intellectuals and socialism, what I find ironic about people who want to accredit that as Hayek's vision of social change is it's actually a short, I mean, it's not a magnum opus of like, here is how the world works, my name's F.A. Hayek. It's far more, I mean, it's right in the title. It's the intellectuals and socialism. He's trying to explain the puzzle of, if this is how the world works and these are all the smart people in the world, then why the heck are they so stupid insofar as they don't understand liberalism? Like, they tend to be socialists. So he's trying to sort of answer that puzzle. He's like, why is it that all of the smart people in the world tend to be favoring of socialism? And he has a sort of like mechanism of the sociology of how it is that you come to be in the intelligentsia. You end up getting A's in your class, but then the capitalist system gives all the money to the people who got C's in your class because they go out and they get real jobs, and you go into like to academia and like writing papers and being an intellectual. So it's sort of tragically ironic when people read that and say, see, we need more secondhand dealers in ideas. Because what Hayek is saying is that the population of secondhand dealers in ideas is going to be inherently propagated by socialists, by collectivists, more so than liberals, because the system's sort of set up against them from the get-go. So the idea of popularizing perspectives isn't really a fair battle at all, because incentives and forms of bias are built into the system of how it is that we associate with one another and learn ideas. So if intellectuals and socialism is not Hayek's outline or vision of social change, but is instead this sort of like short essay quip about the sociology of intellectual communities, where can one find the longer and more detailed exposition of social operation and social change in Hayek's view? I mean, first of all, constitution of liberty and law, legislation, and liberty are the core sort of theoretical, political philosophy and legal theory of Hayek's framework. His economics is predominantly foundational to that, and that's found in individualism and economic order. If you read those three books, I think you're going to get the best vision of what Hayek thinks the world sort of looks and operates like. Now, how the world changes through time, how one recognizes social potentials for reform and failure, that I think is in Hayek's Counter-Revolutions of Science. So, Hayek is decidedly not a populist in any of these works. So again, when many of us are thinking that, like, the thing that like irks me the most, like I spill coffee on myself on a regular basis when I'm like on the interwebs reading something and someone says something like, well, if you want to win, and like I just hate that. Like intellectual discourse isn't really about winning and losing. Social change isn't really that much about winning and losing. Again, it presumes that having more people believe in your ideology is necessarily going to change the world, and I don't think that there is good evidence to suggest that that's the case. Hayek's vision of social change is not about more people being libertarian per se. It's actually about methodology. It's about the qualitative features of social science. The world works better when the people who have control and influence over the world accurately understand how the world works. In the course of the 20th century, it's Hayek's argument that the methodologies of the social sciences, right, so the body of knowledge about how the world works was sort of corrupted by methods that were ill-equipped to recognize how the world really worked. It's sort of like in germ theory of disease. If you don't have a microscope, right, your theory of diseases is going to really suck. The method that you go about diagnosing diseases requires a microscope because that's what's really going on. If you don't have the microscope, you're never going to get a good answer to it. For Hayek, the theory of spontaneous order, as well as like the more humane facets of natural language, deduction, etc., in social science gets displaced by the scientific method and statistical aggregation and those sorts of things. So he's saying that the setup of social science is screwed up, and that tended to reaffirm central planning, socialism, the growth of state power, etc., and then we had all of the sort of subsequent effects therefrom. So for Hayek, it's really all about whether or not the people who do the bulk of the influence and structure have accurate ideas in their quiver of understanding how the world works. In that vein, I mean, it seems like almost elitist to say this, but it seems far less important for there to be more libertarians relative to more collectivists or Republicans or neoconservatives or something. Instead, one way to think about how ideas and intellectual discourse affect society, it would be better to think about like who at any given point in time are like the smartest people in discourse, in this sort of public setting, and what is it that they believe, and how is it that you can get intellectual perspectives into that discussion. Oftentimes, populism works against this. I mean, lots of smart people explicitly dislike associating themselves with certain branding, in large part because they know so many people who are not smart who call themselves those things. And that happens a lot throughout intellectual discourse. Sort of tragically so, but it's basically the reality. I mean, I'm sort of snarky enough to say that like I would rather see the genuine comprehension of something like economics or even history or political science grow in a smaller group of supposed self-identified student libertarians than to see the number of that student group double or triple. That's the basis of what I wanted to say and discuss with this webinar. I guess secondly, I think that there is something to be said about some of the sociological trends that are popular now amidst these discussions. In terms of there's a really great video out right now by Deirdre McCloskey about people are sharing it in response to the Piketty book about capital inequality, and McCloskey's pointing out that in comparative terms to most of human civilization, I mean, yes, all of human civilization has been very unequal, but the greatest sense of inequality is being alive today relative to a long time ago. Those magnitudes matter in a very meaningful way in having these discussions, especially when you understand social science as a process. I mean, it's sort of like, I think of like Niagara Falls, for example. Niagara Falls is like this like massive amount of energy and force of water falling off of a cliff. In any given point in time, some mist, right, some like sort of like negligible effect will be going in the opposite direction. If we think of that as sort of like minority or poor or underrepresented populations might have like localized or counter trend effects within their personal experience, and it might be caused by any number of explanations, but activist focus and sort of to the extent of detracting from other forms of social science, I think can be really problematic insofar as you're missing the forest from the trees, so to speak. To fail to recognize the more foundational trajectory of the waterfall is to be sort of bogged down in details that are borderline irrelevant in the broader sense of social change. So I realize that some of these perspectives might be at odds with a lot of the way in which some of the attendees sort of see the landscape of intellectual discourse that surrounds the liberty movement. I haven't per se like written on these subjects. It's just something that I continually see and interact with and try to communicate on online forums like this, Facebook, etc. So yeah, I'm happy to field questions and answers. We've got, I guess, like 15 minutes left in the formal session, but I've got some extra time I'm happy to go over.
All right, sounds great. Thank you so much, Professor D'Amico. I have 2 questions lined up now, and a reminder, you can use the questions form right there on the right of your screen on the GoToWebinar, and you can get your questions sent in right directly to us, and we'll be able to read it out. So first question for you, Professor D'Amico, from Daniel Duarte. Is there any way to test Hayek's model of social change?
I think so. I mean, I think that a tremendous one way that I think that the evidence supports what Hayek is alluding to is the bulk of the correlations that you see surrounding the Economic Freedom of the World Index, and that's very much what that project has been trying to do for a very long while. So a team of economists came up with the idea at the Fraser Institute: what if we could measure liberty? And the first thing they said was, well, there's different types of liberty. There's economic liberty and then there's social liberty. And this is sort of another challenge and problematic feature of our contemporary discourse. It is popular amongst people who self-identify as libertarians today to say that those two things on normative margins are equally important. But it is an empirical question. If your margin is like how much it matters to you as like person with a philosophy, like sure, maybe we could say that it's equally important. But if you're asking about how social change occurs, that's an empirical question, and they might not be equally important. So for example, like there are not a large or even significant sample of countries that have social liberalism, right, like rights for minorities and women and sort of like individual rights and voting representation and all of these things in political and civic terms without economic freedom, right? There is not a massive amount of really poor places, but that are like incredibly enlightened when it comes to like minority, gay, or women's rights. Instead, the sample of places that we have that have those things all have a strong foundation of prosperity driven by a strong foundation of the institutions that protect economic trade. So, I mean, there are ways in which social science right now is sort of signing the magnitudes or the coefficients in front of the variables of things like how much does wealth creation matter relative to political activism, relative to cultural trends and stuff like that. Like social science is doing that, and there are a lot of really compelling findings coming out of this work. So when you look at the material conditions of the poor, when you look at voting rights and representation for women, all of them seem highly correlated in a patternistic way with economic freedom. And like the authors and designers of this index are explicitly trying to do just that. They're trying to test Hayek's hypothesis that liberty is essentially the explanatory variable in social change.
Okay, great. Question number 2 comes from Edouard Hess, who is in Strasbourg, France. All that being said, do you find Students for Liberty's work relevant to advance the cause of liberty? So taking up your criticism a little bit of the idea-driven approach.
I do think that ideas matter. Again, I think Hayek is arguing that ideas matter. He's arguing that it matters specifically in the arena of professional idea generation, social sciences. I think Students for Liberty is hella better than Young Americans for Liberty. And I think it's built into the name, for example. Like, I don't give a crap if you just happen to be young and like liberty. Like, you don't get a star because you're not an old person. Students for Liberty, I love the fact that students are in the name because it sort of implies that it's an educational project. Oftentimes, I wish that seeing it as such was more evidenced in its members. So I almost want to recommend that they change the name from Students for Liberty to Students of Liberty, right? Like I'm less interested in meeting young people who actively want to change the world, and I'm far more interested in meeting students who actively think that there's something unique about human freedom that needs to be understood, and actively want to understand that better, and actively want to sort of test these hypotheses and disseminate the science behind them. So, I mean, my interest in being involved with Students for Liberty is pretty self-interested insofar as I find it a useful venue for disseminating my own ideas, and an extremely useful venue in discovering good social science talent, kids who are similar to the Institute for Humane Studies, people who are interested in pursuing intellectual careers, pursuing research projects that are focused on comprehending and advancing the case of liberalism. That being said, if you asked me, like, frankly, again, would I, if I could push a button and, for example, have everyone at like the ISFLC conference in the lower end of the IQ spectrum convert to socialism, I would hit it and be left with a much smaller pool of more smarter and informed student activists, or not activists at all, but just students of liberty per se. I think that could arguably be better for the real conditions of liberty in society, if that makes sense. I mean, it's sort of an empirical claim, and I don't have good evidence to back it up per se, but I think it makes sense given the body of evidence that we do know of.
Could you call that almost ivory tower libertarianism?
Say that again.
Could you almost call that ivory tower libertarianism in a way?
I mean, it sounds very elitist. I don't mean it to be such, but I do think that again, the sort of real and practical level of freedom in society is a function of how well the people in society understand the role of freedom in society. Just liking it, just liking freedom, right, in today's world, I don't think is as effective. I think historically that used to work. Tyler Cowen has this really cool quip in The Great Stagnation. He calls it government by ox cart. And he's talking about the role of the New Deal and sort of progressive overhauls of society. And what he notices is like, okay, well, back in the day, government, like in practical terms, was like a guy with a gun and a bayonet, and like he'd have to sort of like ride a horse to your house and say, hey, give me taxes. So that's a high transaction cost of predating on ordinary innocent citizens. What I would call like vulgar libertarianism or natural rights libertarianism or brutalist libertarianism, I call it knee-jerk libertarianism or get off my lawn libertarianism. It doesn't matter why you are angry that the guy with the gun and the horse is in your lawn taking some of your stuff. If you think it's because aliens gifted you your land, like specially, or if you think that like a magic being from beyond the universe, God, sort of empowered you with your land rights, and you just go out and you shake your fist and you say, get off my lawn because it's not right, that historically, back in a day when the transaction costs of actual government are so high, that would probably be sufficient. If everybody in the world woke up in that historical period and said, I'm a crotchety, like, natural rights guy, get off my land just because I say so, that can be sufficient in constraining the size of the government in that environment. That's not really the world that we live in today. The world that we live in today is much more a technocracy than it is a government by ox cart. The world we live in today, when people make those arguments, there is a sort of professional echelon and bureaucracy of people whose job it is to sort of manipulate and reconfigure scientific evidence to dismiss it. And it's not just that that's their job to do, it's that there's a lot of incentives about reacting to what would otherwise be people's sort of like gut-wrench rights approaches. Not to mention the technocratic aspect of it, but the technocracies are all now, like there's a division of labor in technocratic bureaucracy, that the Department of Transportation is distinct from the Department of Health and Nutrition and from the Food and Drug Administration and all these other things. A blanket approach to just saying, meh, I don't need government to do that, stay off my lawn, does not stand up against all of like this sort of like 700-headed hydra of government bureaucracy in today's world. I don't think that a purely ivory tower front is sufficient necessarily in doing that, but what you need is a sort of like systematic body of real scholarship and science that has a robust and diverse sort of toolkit to draw on, so that when people bring up, like this happens to me like all the time. I get in a conversation with someone, I share sort of my general opinions on things, and they wanna sort of like discuss everything under the sun. It's like, what about roads? What about drugs? What about this one obscure historical episode that I know something about that you don't know? I mean, I'm not a universal scholar. I haven't researched everything per se, but it's great when I do know of someone with a book in a specialty area that I can say, well, you should take a look at this book because I think it addresses what you're talking about. In a world where we had a bigger, more prominent ivory tower liberal intelligentsia, it would be a more equipped world to combat this sort of massively technocratic system that we live in.
Okay, and to your point about one historical fact, which of course relates to someone's specific scholarship, I have a question from Gilles Verstraeten, who is coming to us from Brussels in the Eurobubble. What about abolitionism? Wasn't the abolition of slavery something that was driven more by certain moral considerations than by understanding of social sciences?
I don't think so. I think, and again, so how could we test against these two propositions? I would say that slavery is a very pervasive form of social arrangement in the course of human history, with radical declines in the modern era. Radical declines in the modern era shared amongst all environments that experience prosperity, irrespective of the wide variance of those environments that had activist, abolitionist, normatively inspired movements. Do I think that the abolitionist movement was inconsequential? No, I think that they wrote a lot of really interesting things, and I think that it's sort of good to galvanize and reaffirm an opposition to slavery. Do I think that it was necessary or sufficient for emancipation of real slave populations? No, I don't think that that's true with either. I think that arguably inventions and the sort of distribution of incentives created by relatively unplanned and exogenous factors. The cotton gin, for example, basically made the returns to owning slave radically lower than they were in previous periods, because it used to be that the sort of agricultural production functions in the American South were extremely labor intensive because you had to like pick out all of the seeds of the cotton, but the cotton gin basically like sort of had a disemployment effect on those labor units, not to mention that there were massive immigrant populations coming into the States who were basically willing to work at lower costs than what it was costing to operate slave camps and domesticated slave assets. In economic history, most economic historians recognize that the wage system of sovereign labor units is more efficient and productive, and it's not surprising to economic historians that the world over, slavery has radically declined, even in environments that didn't have explicit abolitionist movements.
Okay, great. I'm kind of waiting for any other questions which may come in, but for right now it seems like it's a good part to wrap it up. I do have to thank Professor Daniel D'Amico for taking the time for being with us. Of course, it is now 9 p.m. here for Central European time, and quite a difference there for Professor Dan D'Amico, but thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. And if anybody wants to email me with additional questions, I'm happy to reply.
All right, sounds great, and we'll go ahead and link that as well on our Facebook page and on our website, esfl.info. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good evening.